Good evening, my friends. Welcome to the Bedtime Bard, home to gentle stories for the late hours. Tonight, let's take a quiet walk through the story of Rome, a world of fields and fortresses, laws and legions, markets and marble, where one city learned, step by step, how to hold an empire together. Rome's story is a long, remarkable journey, from humble beginnings to a legendary empire. More than 2,000 years ago, it started as a modest community. A few simple homes stood on a handful of hills beside the slow waters of the Tiber River. In those early days, no one could have guessed what Rome would one day become. And yet, step by step, Rome grew. This story stretches across many centuries. It moves through myth and history, calm years and hard ones, moments of triumph and moments of loss. We'll begin with Rome's earliest legends. Then we'll follow the rise of the Republic, and from there, we'll enter the age of emperors and the long transformation of Roman power in the West. Along the way, we'll notice how Rome left traces that still surround us today, in words we use, in legal traditions, and in ideas about government and citizenship. Rome's history can feel vast. It can also feel complicated. But here, we'll explore it quietly, in a simple, flowing way, like a calm walk through time. One era will lead naturally into the next, and the events of the past will settle into a story you can easily follow. As we move forward, from a village to a world-spanning state, you'll see how a civilization can grow, change, and leave behind something lasting. Because Rome's story is, at its heart, a story of resilience and adaptation. It is a story of ordinary people living their lives, and of leaders making choices that shaped the world around them. It is a story of conflict, yes, but also of building, of laws, of roads, of shared ideas. It isn't just one story. It is many stories, woven together across generations. Each one is a small chapter in Rome's long journey. So let's begin at the very start, with the place where Rome began, and the early days of a city that would one day become an empire. To understand Rome's rise, it helps to picture the land where it all began. Rome grew near the center of the Italian peninsula. Italy stretches into the Mediterranean like a boot, and Rome sits about halfway down the western side. That position would one day help Rome connect with many different coasts and cultures. The climate was generally mild, with enough rain and sunlight to support farming. Grain crops did well, along with grapes and olives, and the nearby hills and valleys supplied timber and stone. In short, the land around Rome provided an early community with most of the essentials it needed to survive, and over time, to become stronger. Near a bend in the Tiber River, a cluster of low hills rose from the surrounding landscape. Long before Rome became a city, small groups of farmers and shepherds settled on and around these hills. The river was a lifeline. It provided water for crops and animals. It offered fish, and it created a natural route for travel and trade. The hills offered protection. They helped people stay above floods, and they gave high ground to watch the surrounding valley. Over time, clusters of wooden huts on different hills began to draw closer together. Separate hamlets slowly became a single settlement. Archaeologists generally believe that by around the 8th century BC, these communities were beginning to merge into something more like a town. Later, legends blossomed to explain how Rome began. The most famous tells of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. According to the myth, they were the sons of a Latin princess and the war god Mars. As infants, they were abandoned near the Tiber. A she-wolf, the story says, discovered the twins and fed them. Later, a shepherd took them into his home and raised them. As they became adults, the brothers decided to found a new city on the hills where their lives had been spared. But the story takes a dark turn. A dispute erupts. Romulus kills Remus. Romulus becomes the first ruler of the new city, and he names it Rome after himself. For Romans, the tale offered a powerful origin, touched by the gods and shaped by loss. Of course, the real beginnings of Rome were probably less dramatic. More likely, Latin-speaking villagers gradually joined together for protection, trade, and shared resources. The site had practical advantages: a river crossing, defensible high ground, and routes used by merchants and travelers. Over time, the settlement grew more organized. What began as scattered huts became a town with leaders, customs, and rules. As the community expanded, people began to shape their shared life. They built small shrines to honor their gods. They formed meeting places to settle disputes and make decisions. And they gathered a basic fighting force: ordinary farmers who could defend their homes when danger came. Slowly, the village on the Tiber was becoming a city. It was still only one town among many in Italy. There were no grand palaces and no marble monuments. Early Rome was modest: mud brick walls, thatched roofs, and fields stretching outward into pasture land. But even then, its people were curious and adaptable. They traded with nearby towns. They learned skills and ideas from their neighbors. To the north were the Etruscans, whose cities were influential in central Italy. From them, Romans would adopt many techniques and customs. To the south were Greek-speaking colonies, which also left a lasting imprint on Roman culture. Rome absorbed influences from both directions, while gradually forming an identity of its own. From this foundation, the fertile land, the protective hills, and the meeting of cultures, Rome was poised to grow. Before long, it would become a kingdom, ruled by kings who shaped the early institutions of Roman life. And that is the next step in our journey: the first kings of Rome, and the early outline of a city with ambitions beyond its humble beginnings. In its earliest centuries, Rome was ruled by kings. After Romulus, the city's legendary founder, Roman tradition says that 6 more kings followed. Some were described as Latin, like many of Rome's early inhabitants. Others were said to be Etruscan, from the more developed cities to the north. In the old stories, each king added something to Rome's growth. One is remembered for shaping religious rituals and the calendar. Another is credited with public works, including an early sewer system and major building projects on the Capitoline Hill. Over time, a forum began to take shape as the center of public life, and Rome started to look less like a cluster of huts and more like a small city with growing ambitions. Even in those days, Rome was not ruled by one man alone. There was a council of elders called the Senate. It advised the king and represented leading families. There were also assemblies where free male citizens could gather. They heard announcements. They expressed approval. They offered support. And even if their power was limited, the idea was already present that Rome belonged in some sense to its people, not only to a ruler. Over time, many Romans grew uneasy with monarchy. They valued independence, and they especially disliked the idea of a king who ruled unfairly. The last king was Tarquin, remembered in later tradition as Tarquin the Proud. According to Roman accounts, he ruled harshly and ignored the usual restraints. And then the stories tell of a shocking outrage committed by members of the royal house against a noblewoman. When Tarquin failed to punish those responsible, anger spread through the city. Rome reached a breaking point. Leading citizens, supported by many others, rose in revolt. Tarquin was expelled, and the monarchy was abolished around 509 BC. Roman tradition held that this moment mattered above all others. After centuries under kings, Romans vowed that no one would rule them as king again. In place of monarchy, Rome created a new system, the Republic. The word republic comes from the Latin phrase res publica, meaning the public thing, or the shared commonwealth. In Rome's ideal vision, power would not belong to a king. It would be held by officials chosen from among the citizens. At the top were 2 consuls. They were elected each year. They led the government and commanded armies. 2 consuls mattered. It meant no single person could hold power alone. Each could block the other, and their term lasted only 1 year. When the year ended, they stepped down and returned to ordinary life. The Senate remained influential as well. It advised magistrates and guided long-term policy. Other offices developed too, including praetors, who oversaw courts and legal matters, and officials who managed public finances. Step by step, Rome built a complicated but durable machinery of government. But Romans were practical. They knew emergencies could arise, moments when swift action was needed. For those rare times, they used a special office, dictator. A dictator could be appointed during a severe crisis, such as invasion or internal disorder. This person held extraordinary authority for a limited time, traditionally up to 6 months. When the crisis ended, the dictator was expected to step down. This was meant to be a safeguard. Rome could act quickly without turning back into a monarchy. A famous story illustrates the ideal. Cincinnatus, a farmer and former commander, was named dictator when enemies threatened Rome. He led the army to victory, and then, as the story goes, he resigned and returned to his plow within 15 days. Romans loved this story. It captured what they admired most: duty, restraint, and suspicion of one-man rule. However, the early republic was not a paradise of equality. Roman society was divided into 2 broad groups: patricians and plebeians. Patricians were a small circle of elite families. They claimed ancient status and held much of the early political power. Plebeians were the wider body of citizens: farmers, traders, craftsmen, and many others. Plebeians could vote in assemblies, but early on they faced real limits. Access to the highest offices was restricted. Marriage across class lines was constrained. And for a long time, the laws were not written down. That allowed powerful men to interpret custom in ways that favored their own class. This imbalance created tension that would shape Rome for generations. Historians call this long conflict the struggle of the orders. It was not usually a single, continuous civil war. More often, it was a slow contest over rights, protections, and political voice. Plebeians wanted safeguards against abuse. They wanted representation. And they had leverage. They were a large part of the workforce, and they filled the ranks of the citizen army. At times, plebeian communities withdrew their labor and refused military service. It was a kind of collective pressure meant to force reform. One early victory was the creation of the tribunes of the plebs. Tribunes were officials elected by plebeians to defend plebeian interests. A tribune's great power was the veto. A tribune could block actions that seemed unjust, and the office was protected by a strong tradition. Tribunes were declared sacrosanct. Harming one was forbidden. Another major milestone came when Rome wrote its laws down. According to tradition, around 450 BC, Romans inscribed a legal code on 12 tablets and displayed it in the Forum. These 12 tables dealt with property, family, crime, and everyday disputes between citizens. Some rules seem harsh to modern eyes, others seem strange, but the importance was clear. The law was no longer hidden. Ordinary citizens could see it, and powerful families could no longer claim secret knowledge as easily as before. It was a crucial step toward a more predictable idea of justice. Over time, plebeians gained ground. They won access to more offices. Eventually, one of the two consuls could be a plebeian. Step by step, across the middle centuries of the Republic, the gap between the classes narrowed. The Republic became more unified, at least among free male citizens. And Rome developed something it would always take pride in, a tradition of law and citizenship. Romans believed their system set them apart from kings and tyrants elsewhere. They valued procedure, compromise, and the idea that power should be limited. As these internal struggles eased, Rome changed. It was no longer just a small city-state. It became the leading member of a growing network of Italian communities. The citizen army invested in protecting its rights made Rome resilient, and a flexible system of government gave the state stability. Rome had defended its freedom at home. Now, it would turn outward. With domestic affairs settling, Rome began to face challenges beyond its walls, first in Italy, and later across the wider Mediterranean. A new phase was beginning: expansion, conflict, and the rise of Rome as a regional power. In the centuries after the founding of the Republic, Rome expanded across the Italian peninsula. It did not happen all at once. It was a gradual, step-by-step process, shaped by small wars, shifting alliances, and hard-won settlements. At first, Rome dealt with its closest neighbors. Nearby Latin towns sometimes resisted Rome. Over time, many were absorbed or tied to Rome as allied communities. To the north were the Etruscans, a powerful people who had once dominated Rome during the Age of Kings. To the south were other Italian peoples, along with Greek-speaking cities along the coast. Each campaigning season, Roman citizen soldiers marched out. At first, they fought to protect Rome's interests. Before long, they fought to widen them. One early shock came from outside central Italy. Groups of Gauls moved into the peninsula from beyond the Alps. Tradition often dates the sack of Rome to 390 BC, when a Gaulish force defeated the Romans and entered the city. Much of the population fled. Tradition says the last defenders held out on the Capitoline Hill. Another famous story tells of sacred geese that made a sudden noise in the night, warning the guards in time to prevent a surprise attack. Whatever details we accept, the larger outcome is clear. Rome was forced into a humiliating settlement, including a ransom paid in gold, before the invaders finally withdrew. Rome rebuilt. It strengthened its defenses. It reorganized its military habits, and it carried forward a lasting determination that the city would not be caught so exposed again. After recovering, Rome resumed its push across Italy. Over the following generations, Rome fought a series of difficult wars against the Samnites, a mountain people of central Italy. These are often grouped together as the Samnite Wars. Rome suffered serious setbacks, but it endured. In the end, it established dominance through much of central Italy. Rome also collided with the Greek cities of the south. The most famous episode involved King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a relative of Alexander the Great by marriage and a veteran of the Hellenistic world. In 280 BC, Pyrrhus crossed into Italy to support the Greek city of Tarentum. Pyrrhus was a gifted commander. He also brought something the Romans had rarely faced: war elephants. The sight of them unsettled Roman troops, at least at first. Pyrrhus won battles, but the cost was heavy. Later writers preserved a famous line attributed to him, that another victory like those, and he would be ruined. In the end, Pyrrhus could not sustain the struggle. He withdrew from Italy, and from his story comes the phrase, Pyrrhic victory. A victory so costly, it hardly feels like a victory at all. With Pyrrhus gone, Rome tightened its hold on the south. By roughly 270 BC, Rome was the leading power across almost all of Italy. Rome's success did not come from warfare alone. Rome was also skilled at building a system that could last. Conquered communities were not always destroyed. Many were drawn into Rome's network in different ways. Some communities received Roman citizenship. Others became allies. These allies were expected to supply troops when Rome called, which greatly increased the manpower Rome could draw on. In return, they gained protection, status, and often a share in the rewards of conquest. Rome also founded colonies, new settlements of Roman citizens, in strategic locations. These colonies served as anchors, securing key routes and strengthening Roman influence in a region. And Rome built roads. Routes such as the Appian Way stretched across the peninsula. Roads moved armies faster, but they also carried trade, messages, and Roman authority. Over time, Italy was being knit together under Roman leadership. By the 3rd century BC, Rome was a major power in Italy, and now it began to collide with another great power in the Western Mediterranean, Carthage. Carthage was a wealthy city-state in North Africa, in what is now Tunisia. It was a trading power with far-reaching influence, with possessions and allies across the Western Mediterranean, especially on islands like Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Carthage was also famous for its navy, experienced sailors, strong ships, and long-established sea routes. For a time, Rome and Carthage managed their relationship through treaties and informal boundaries. But as Rome's influence expanded, it pressed into places Carthage considered central to its own security, especially Sicily. In 264 BC, tensions in Sicily ignited the first war between Rome and Carthage. What began as a local dispute widened into a long, exhausting conflict. The Romans called the Carthaginians Poeni, meaning Phoenicians. From that word comes the name Punic. This war was fought largely at sea, around Sicily and the waters beyond it. Carthage was a naval power. Rome was mainly a land power, and it had to build a fleet almost from nothing. At first, Romans had little naval experience, but they adapted. They built warships modeled on captured Carthaginian vessels and they trained crews to row and fight at sea. They also introduced a device that played to Roman strengths. It was called the corvus, meaning raven. It was a boarding bridge with a spike, designed to lock onto an enemy ship. Once the ships were held together, Roman soldiers could cross and fight hand to hand, turning a sea battle into something closer to a land battle. The war dragged on for more than 2 decades. Both sides suffered heavy losses. Rome endured storms and disasters at sea. It suffered defeats, and then it rebuilt again and again. Finally, in 241 BC, Rome won a decisive naval victory near the Aegates Islands. Carthage, exhausted and short of money, asked for peace. Carthage gave up Sicily. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province. Carthage also agreed to pay a large indemnity, spread over time. Rome had proven it could fight beyond Italy, and it had shown a quality that would appear again and again, a steady refusal to quit. But the rivalry was not over. In the troubled years after the war, Rome took Sardinia and Corsica from Carthage, widening its reach across the sea. Carthage, meanwhile, sought new resources elsewhere. A Carthaginian general named Hamilcar Barca led expansion into Iberia, building a new base of power. He brought his young son, Hannibal, with him. Later tradition says Hamilcar made Hannibal swear an oath of hatred against Rome. Whether legend or not, it captures something real. The conflict between these two powers was far from finished. A new war was approaching, longer, harsher, and far more dangerous than the first. And it would be linked, above all, to Hannibal. The Second Punic War, fought against Hannibal of Carthage, was one of the most frightening tests the Roman Republic ever endured. It began in 218 BC, when Hannibal made a bold and unexpected choice. Instead of challenging Rome mainly at sea, he aimed for Italy itself. He led an army out of Spain and marched north through Gaul, in what is now France. And then he attempted what many thought could not be done. He crossed the Alps into Italy, bringing soldiers, cavalry, and a small number of war elephants. The journey was punishing. The cold was severe. The mountain paths were narrow and dangerous. Some local groups attacked along the way. Many of Hannibal's men died during the crossing, and most of the elephants did not survive. Still, Hannibal reached Italy with a corps of hardened troops, ready to fight Rome on Roman ground. The Romans were stunned. An enemy army had appeared from the north, deep in Italy, far sooner than anyone expected. Once in Italy, Hannibal proved to be a remarkable tactician. He won a series of major victories. At the Trebia River, he drew Roman forces into a battle on ground, and at a moment that favored him. Then, in 217 BC, he laid an ambush at Lake Trasimene. Roman troops were caught in a confined space, with enemy forces moving from higher ground. The result was a devastating defeat. Hannibal's greatest triumph came the next year in 216 BC at Cannae in southern Italy. At Cannae, Hannibal carried out a famous encirclement. His center gave ground in a controlled way, drawing the Romans inward. Then his forces closed around the flanks, compressing the Roman army into a tightening ring. Ancient writers disagree on the exact number. One major account places Roman losses around 70,000, while others suggest fewer. Either way, tens of thousands were killed. Many Roman leaders died. Thousands of experienced soldiers were gone. In Rome, fear spread. Some allies began to waver, and a number of communities in southern Italy shifted their loyalty. And yet Rome did not surrender. In that dark moment, the Republic showed the quality it is best known for: endurance. The Senate and the people took extraordinary measures. New legions were raised. The age requirements were stretched. In the emergency, Rome even raised units from enslaved men, and in some cases offered freedom after their service. A cautious leader came to represent Rome's strategy in those years: Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius was appointed dictator, and he chose a method that frustrated many Romans. He refused to give Hannibal the decisive battle Hannibal wanted. Instead, he shadowed Hannibal's movements. He struck when opportunities were safe. He disrupted supply lines when he could. He forced Hannibal to keep marching, always searching for food, reinforcements, and allies. Fabius tried to wear him down through time and steady pressure. This approach earned him a lasting nickname: the Delayer. Some Romans disliked it. They wanted a clear victory. But after Cannae, caution was a form of survival. Hannibal remained dangerous for years. He moved across Italy, won smaller engagements, and tried to draw more allies away from Rome. But he could not bring the war to a quick end, and the city of Rome itself did not fall. The Republic also refused to negotiate on Hannibal's terms. Instead, Rome aimed to outlast him. Over time, the momentum began to shift. Rome found new leaders and a new plan. The rising star was Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus. Scipio understood something crucial. Rome could not end the war simply by chasing Hannibal across Italy. It needed to put pressure on Carthage's wider position in the Mediterranean. First, Scipio campaigned in Spain and broke Carthaginian power there, cutting Hannibal off from important resources and support. Then, in 204 BC, Scipio took an even bolder step. He sailed to North Africa with a Roman army and threatened Carthage itself. Carthage had little choice. It recalled Hannibal from Italy. After more than a decade of campaigning on Roman soil, he left without ever forcing Rome to surrender. In 202 BC, the war reached its final showdown at Zama in North Africa. Scipio faced Hannibal in a decisive battle. Hannibal again brought elephants to the front. But by this point, Roman forces had learned how to reduce their impact, creating space and disordering the charge. Then the infantry lines met. The fighting was intense, and neither side gave way easily. But Scipio's army eventually gained the advantage. Hannibal was defeated and withdrew from the field. Carthage sued for peace. This time, the terms were severe. Carthage gave up its fleet. It agreed to pay a large indemnity over many years, and it accepted strict limits on making war without Rome's approval. Hannibal survived, but Carthage's freedom of action was sharply reduced. The Second Punic War was a turning point. It was the greatest danger the Republic had yet faced, and for a time Rome truly did stand on the edge of collapse. But by surviving and finally winning, Rome emerged more powerful than before. The Romans lost armies. They lost commanders. They endured invasion at home. And still, they fought on. After the war, Rome stood as the strongest power in the Western Mediterranean. Carthage, once a near equal rival, was no longer able to challenge Rome in the same way. Years later, in 146 BC, Rome would destroy Carthage in the Third Punic War. By then, Carthage had already been constrained for generations. The period of greatest danger had passed with Hannibal's defeat. But Rome did not have much time to rest. Even while fighting Hannibal, Rome became drawn into conflict in the eastern Mediterranean. Macedon made common cause with Carthage, and Rome responded with war. In the decades that followed, Rome intervened repeatedly in Greece and Asia Minor. Step by step, major Hellenistic kingdoms were defeated or forced into Roman terms. Macedon was eventually brought under Roman control. Greek cities fell under Roman dominance, and the Seleucid kingdom was compelled to accept a settlement dictated by Rome. Not all of this was planned from the beginning, but the result was clear. Rome's influence now reached across the Mediterranean. In later centuries, Romans would call that sea Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea. This expansion brought immense wealth, booty, new revenues, and growing trade. But with great gains came new pressures. Hannibal's invasion had damaged parts of Italy. Many farms struggled to recover. Many families never saw their soldiers return. And the flood of wealth made some Romans astonishingly rich, while many others found life harder and more uncertain. The Republic's old institutions would be tested by these changes. Social and political conflict began to gather in the distance, shaped partly by Rome's very success. Still, when the Punic Wars ended, one thing was undeniable. Rome had stepped onto the world stage, and it would not be pushed aside easily. Rome endured the long Hannibalic War through patience, effort, and sheer persistence. When the war finally ended, victory opened the door to a new era. Rome expanded farther, wealth flowed in, and slowly, new tensions began to rise at home. By the dawn of the 1st century BC, Rome had gained something like an empire, if not in name, then in daily reality. From Spain to Greece, more and more communities answered to Rome, and yet, in the city itself, the Republic still looked familiar. There were elected consuls, there was a senate, the old framework remained. But inside that framework, pressure was quietly building. A system designed for one city now had to govern distant provinces. It also had to manage sudden wealth, larger populations, and constant military demands. Rome's expansion brought success abroad, even as it stirred strain at home. The Republic was growing powerful in the wider world, while its balance began to slip. One major problem was the widening divide between rich and poor. Long wars changed life in Italy. For generations, small farmers had formed a steady foundation of Roman society. They also supplied many of Rome's soldiers. But years of campaigning meant many men were away from their land for long stretches of time. Fields went untended. Some regions had also suffered earlier destruction during major wars. Debt accumulated. Repairs were delayed. And many farmers returned home to find that rebuilding was harder than they had imagined. Wealthy landowners often took advantage of this situation. Over time, smaller plots were bought up and combined into large estates, sometimes described as latifundia. These estates could be worked by enslaved labor, people captured in Rome's wars, though other forms of labor existed too. The larger point was that many Romans who had once been independent farmers lost their land and their independence. Some drifted into towns and cities, especially Rome, looking for work, stability, or support. In the capital, many lived in crowded apartment buildings. Life there could be cramped, noisy, and sometimes unsafe. For some families, access to cheap or subsidized grain became an important part of getting by. The contrast grew sharper. A small class of extremely wealthy nobles stood on one side, while a swelling population of struggling citizens gathered on the other. Soon, Roman politics began to circle around one question: what should be done? This is where the Gracchus brothers enter the story, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus served as tribune of the plebs. He looked at the growing number of dispossessed farmers and argued for land reform. His proposal focused on public land that wealthy Romans had come to control. Some of it, he believed, should be redistributed to citizens who had lost their footing. To Tiberius, it wasn't only about fairness, it was also about stability. He wanted to restore small landholders and strengthen the pool of men who could serve in the army. The Senate and the elite resisted strongly. They stood to lose land, influence, and long-held advantage. Tiberius pushed ahead anyway. He took the proposal directly to the People's Assembly. As tribune, he could do this legally, but it cut against tradition and alarmed many in the ruling class. His reform passed, and then the conflict turned violent. When Tiberius sought a second term, unusual and deeply unsettling to his opponents, fighting broke out during a public gathering. Tiberius and many of his supporters were killed in the chaos. It was a shocking moment. Political conflict had spilled into bloodshed in the heart of the Republic. A decade later, his younger brother Gaius took up the cause. Gaius was an energetic organizer, and his program was broader. He supported grain support for the urban poor. He proposed new colonies meant to offer land and opportunity, including a controversial plan connected to the site of Carthage. He also tried to reduce the Senate's dominance by expanding the influence of wealthy non-senators, especially in juries and parts of provincial oversight. For a time, Gaius gained enormous popularity, but resistance hardened, tensions rose, violence returned. In 121 BC, Gaius died. Ancient accounts differ on the details of his final moments. What is clear? A harsh crackdown and the deaths of many who had stood with him. The pattern was becoming harder to ignore. The old habits of compromise were weakening. Roman politics was growing more bitter and more divided. And when arguments failed, people increasingly turned to intimidation and force. While Rome struggled at home, it also faced challenges governing abroad. Provinces were often exploited. Governors could squeeze money from local communities. Tax collectors sometimes demanded far more than was fair. Corruption was common, and resentment grew. Back in Rome, ambitious men watched these patterns and learned a quiet lesson. In a system under strain, bold actions could bring unusual influence. The Republic was beginning to produce figures who could gather personal loyalty, whether from crowds in the streets or soldiers in the field. In the late 2nd century BC, one such figure rose: Gaius Marius. Marius was a skilled general from a plebeian background. He gained fame through victories in North Africa during the war against Jugurtha. Later, he helped defeat invading Germanic groups, including the Cimbri and the Teutones, in conflicts that frightened many Romans and seemed to threaten Italy itself. His success made him enormously popular. Marius was elected consul 7 times, an extraordinary number. Many people saw him as a defender of the Republic. In these same years, Rome's armies were changing, recruitment was widening, and poor citizens increasingly filled the ranks. Traditions that had once tied military service to property became less rigid over time. The state took a larger role in equipping soldiers, and long-term service became more common. This shift strengthened Rome's army and offered poorer citizens a path to pay and purpose. The legions became more experienced and more professional. But it also changed something subtle. Many veterans came to depend on their commanders for rewards after service, land, money, or the chance to begin again. Over time, personal loyalty could matter more than loyalty to distant institutions. Marius did not create this transformation alone, but the changing shape of the army would soon play a major role in Rome's political struggles. Around the same time, Rome faced a crisis inside Italy itself, the social war. Rome's Italian allies had fought alongside Roman armies for generations. They shared the dangers of war, but many still lacked full citizenship. Over time, frustration grew. They wanted rights. They wanted a real political voice. In the early 90s BC, that frustration erupted into revolt. Italian communities rose up across the peninsula, seeking either equal status within the Roman system or a future outside it. The fighting was bitter, and the cost was high. Rome eventually prevailed militarily, but it also made concessions. Citizenship was offered to allies who laid down arms, and in the years that followed, citizenship was extended broadly across Italy's free population. The process was complicated and often contentious, but the direction was clear. It was a historic shift. Roman identity now stretched far beyond the city of Rome. In time, this would bind Italy more tightly together, but in the short term, the disruption of war and the sudden expansion of the citizen body added strain to an already unstable political world. By the 80s BC, the Republic was deeply stressed. Economic inequality had sharpened. Political violence had become familiar. Overseas wealth flowed back to Rome, while anger and frustration rose at home. And successful generals could now attract long loyalty from soldiers who hoped for a better future after service. The Republic was trying to manage an expanding empire with institutions designed for a single city. Before long, that strain would break into open conflict. The first major rupture came when an ambitious aristocratic general, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, marched his legions on Rome itself. It was an act that shocked the Republic and showed how far the old rules had begun to bend. Rome was about to be tested in a way it had never faced before. The era of tension was becoming an era of civil war, and the foundations of the Republic were beginning to crack. The Roman Republic had survived many storms, but in the 1st century BC, it began to buckle under the strain. The old political order, built on shared offices and mutual limits, started to fail. Ambitious men learned how to turn Rome's armies inward, and the Republic slid, step by step, into civil war. One clear turning point can be traced to Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He was a talented general, known for success in the social war and for campaigns in the Greek-speaking East. He also came from the conservative aristocracy, and he had a bitter rivalry with the older commander Gaius Marius. In 88 BC, a dispute erupted over a single question: who would command the war against King Mithridates of Pontus? The Senate backed Sulla, but political opponents in Rome managed to transfer the command away from him, placing it in Marius's hands instead. Sulla responded with something that seemed unthinkable. He marched his legions on Rome itself. It was the first time a Roman commander led a Roman army against the city. He seized control, declared enemies outlaws, and forced the political order to bend to military power. Marius fled. Sulla then left for the Eastern War, but the crisis at home did not end. During Sulla's absence, Marius returned and took power briefly. Then, in 82 BC, Sulla came back victorious. Rome fell into another round of civil war. Sulla won, and the Senate named him dictator, not for the usual short emergency term, but with sweeping authority to reform the republic. Soon afterward, he published lists of enemies called proscriptions. Those named could be killed, and their property could be seized. Ancient accounts suggest the violence and confiscations were extensive. Many died. Many more learned to stay silent. Sulla insisted he was restoring order. He claimed he was saving the republic, not ending it. He weakened the tribunes, whose office could challenge the elite. He strengthened the Senate, filling it with supporters. He also imposed rules meant to control careers and limit sudden rises to power. And then, in 79 BC, he resigned his dictatorship and retired. It shocked Rome. Sulla died not long after, but the lesson remained. Power could be taken by force, and political violence had become a tool that others would remember. Rome tried to return to ordinary politics, but ordinary politics no longer worked as it once had. Two figures rose quickly, Pompey and Crassus. Pompey, later called the Great, was a gifted young general who gained fame through military success. Crassus was the wealthiest man in Rome, powerful through money and connections. He also gained prestige after helping defeat Spartacus and the slave revolt in 71 BC. Together, Pompey and Crassus became consuls in 70 BC. As consuls, they rolled back some of Sulla's restrictions. Most notably, they restored the full powers of the tribunes of the plebs. Pompey then gained even more glory in a special command against piracy. In a remarkably short time, he cleared major sea lanes and helped secure Rome's grain supply. After that, he was sent east to finish the long war against Mithridates. Pompey defeated the king and reorganized the region. Some territories were turned into provinces. Others became client kingdoms tied to Rome. By the early 60s BC, the Eastern Mediterranean had been reshaped under Roman oversight. Pompey returned to Italy celebrated like a hero from an older age. He dismissed his army outside the city, showing respect for tradition. But the Senate grew uneasy. It delayed approving parts of his settlement, and it resisted land grants for his veterans. The old system was still there, but it no longer moved smoothly. Around the same time, Julius Caesar was rising. He came from an old patrician family whose branch was no longer at the center of power. But Caesar was ambitious, charismatic, and politically sharp. He built popularity through public display and careful alliances. Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus soon realized they could dominate Roman politics together. In 60 BC, they formed an informal alliance, later called the First Triumvirate. Each wanted something. Each needed the others to get it. With their combined influence, Caesar became consul in 59 BC. After his term, he secured a long military command in Gaul. That command would change everything. Over the years that followed, Caesar fought major campaigns in Gaul. He gained enormous wealth and fame. He also wrote accounts of his wars that were widely read in Rome. Most importantly, his soldiers became deeply loyal to him. But the alliance did not last. In 53 BC, Crassus died far from Rome, defeated in the east at Carrhae. With Crassus gone, Pompey and Caesar drifted apart. Pompey moved closer to the Senate's conservative leaders, and the Senate began to view Caesar as a dangerous rival. As Caesar's command neared its end, demands hardened. He was ordered to give up his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. For Caesar, returning without protection meant risk. He sought a compromise. It was refused. In early 49 BC, Caesar made his choice. He led one of his legions across the Rubicon River, a boundary that a commander was not supposed to cross under arms. According to later tradition, he marked the moment with a dramatic phrase, "The die is cast." Civil war had begun. Pompey and many senators fled Italy and regrouped in Greece. Caesar moved quickly and secured Italy with little resistance. But the war could not truly end until Pompey's main army was defeated. That decisive battle came at Pharsalus in 48 BC. Pompey's forces were larger, but Caesar's veterans won. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for refuge. Instead, he was killed on arrival by men seeking to win Caesar's favor. Caesar returned to Rome as the dominant figure in the Roman world. The Senate still existed, but it was intimidated and increasingly filled with Caesar's supporters. Caesar accepted dictatorships of longer duration than tradition had imagined. And in 44 BC, he was named dictator for life. Caesar then tried to stabilize the state. He expanded citizenship in some communities. He enlarged the Senate and brought in new supporters. He planned colonies for veterans and for the poor. He pursued reforms meant to make provincial administration more orderly. And he reformed the calendar. The Julian calendar created a 365-day year with a leap year system, replacing an older calendar that had become confusing and politically easy to manipulate. To many Romans, Caesar looked like the only man capable of governing an empire. To others, he looked like the end of Roman freedom. Kingship was a hated memory, and the word rex carried a sharp sting. Caesar's authority felt too close to monarchy. Rumors spread that he wanted a crown. At a public festival, a diadem, a symbolic crown, was offered to him, and he refused it. But the moment only deepened suspicion. Some wondered whether the gesture had been a test. A group of senators decided the Republic could not survive with Caesar alive. In March of 44 BC, the conspirators chose to act. They told themselves they were saving Rome's traditions, but their choice would unleash a new wave of instability. On the Ides of March 15th, 44 BC, Caesar attended a Senate meeting held near Pompey's theater, in a space being used as a temporary Senate house. The conspirators crowded close as if to present a petition. Then daggers appeared from beneath their togas. Caesar was stabbed many times. Later writers imagined famous last words, but we cannot know what he truly said. What is certain is that Caesar fell and died in the chamber near a statue of Pompey. The assassins expected the city to praise them. They rushed out calling, "For liberty." Instead, Rome reacted with confusion, fear, and grief. Many people had supported Caesar. He had given games, offered relief, and brought a sense, real or not, that order was returning. When Mark Antony delivered a powerful funeral address, the mood in the city shifted. Crowds turned against the conspirators, and leading assassins fled. Caesar's death did not restore the Republic. It shattered what stability remained. Power did not return to the Senate. It became a prize to be fought over. Soon, two figures stood out. One was Mark Antony, Caesar's ally. The other was Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and legal heir, young but already determined. At first, they joined forces against Caesar's killers. Later, they would turn on each other. Julius Caesar's name is one of the most famous in Roman history. His life marked the moment when the old republic began to give way to something new. Caesar was a man of many talents. Later writers describe him as charming, quick-minded, and intensely driven. He came from an old aristocratic family. Though his own branch had lost much of its influence, he rebuilt his standing through ambition, patience, and political skill. Early in his career, he survived a dangerous moment. During Sulla's proscriptions, Caesar was at risk. He escaped the worst of the danger and was allowed to live. It taught him something he never forgot. In Roman politics, the line between influence and death could be thin. He rose through the ladder of offices while keeping close to popular causes. He cultivated support among ordinary citizens. He also built a reputation for bold confidence. One famous story captures it. Pirates captured him at sea. Later accounts say he joked with them, then promised he would punish them. After he was released, he raised a small force and did exactly that. As a commander, Caesar was decisive and inventive. His campaigns in Gaul showed strategic skill and a powerful ability to inspire loyalty. He shared hardships with his soldiers, and they trusted him. And during the Civil War, Caesar often chose mercy. He pardoned defeated Roman nobles rather than executing them. He believed clemency could help heal the state, while also strengthening his own position. When Caesar accepted the title of dictator for life, many Romans understood what it signaled. The Republic still existed in name, but the old balance had faded. Caesar did not present himself as a tyrant. He presented himself as the man who could fix what years of disorder had broken. Many ordinary Romans admired him. He offered stability after years of upheaval. But inside the Senate, fear continued to grow. As Caesar prepared for a new campaign in the East, anxiety deepened. A long absence could shift politics in Rome. Some feared that once power settled in one man's hands, it would never return to the old system. What matters most about Caesar is this: his life and death marked the final failure of the Republican system. After the assassination, Rome could not stitch itself back together. The struggle for power only grew larger and more violent. In the next chapter, Octavian will rise from the chaos. He will learn from Caesar's triumphs and his mistakes, and he will build a new order, one that resembles the old republic on the surface, but is very different underneath. Caesar's legacy also lived on through his name. Caesar became a title linked with rule and authority for centuries. And in the quiet wake of his death, Rome stepped toward its next transformation, the age of Augustus and the Roman Empire. After Caesar's death, Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, stood at a crossroads. Few could have predicted that this quiet, often unwell young heir would become Rome's first emperor in all but name. But Octavian proved to be shrewd, patient, and deeply determined. In the chaotic years after the assassination, he outmaneuvered his rivals and emerged as the sole master of the Roman world. In 27 BC, he was granted the honorific title Augustus, meaning revered or illustrious, and it is by this name that history remembers him. Augustus would rule for more than 4 decades. After a long century of upheaval, his reign brought Rome a steadier sense of order and a widely remembered peace. The rise of Augustus was not straightforward. After forming an alliance with Mark Antony to defeat Caesar's assassins, tensions grew between the two victors. Antony took charge of the eastern provinces and formed a personal and political alliance with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Octavian controlled the western provinces, including Italy and Rome itself. Over time, mistrust deepened. Propaganda poisoned the partnership. Octavian portrayed Antony as a man who had drifted away from Rome, pulled into Cleopatra's world, and willing to put personal ties above Roman duty. By 32 BC, open conflict was close. The decisive confrontation came at Actium in 31 BC, a naval battle off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, led by his trusted commander Agrippa, defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The defeated pair fled to Egypt, and in 30 BC, as Octavian's forces closed in, Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives. With Egypt's fall, Octavian became the unchallenged ruler of Rome's Mediterranean world. Egypt was annexed as a special imperial possession, and its wealth would help fund Augustus's new order. Rome now had one supreme leader, but Romans still distrusted the idea of a king. Octavian's next task was delicate. He needed to hold power without looking like he had rebuilt the hated monarchy. Romans might accept one-man rule in practice, but they resisted it in language and ceremony. So Octavian engineered a careful settlement. In 27 BC, he announced publicly that he was restoring authority to the Senate and the Roman people, and that he would step back from his extraordinary role. The Senate urged him to remain, and a new arrangement followed, one that preserved old forms while placing real control in Octavian's hands. He received authority over key provinces where most legions were stationed. In practical terms, that meant he controlled the army. He also received the name Augustus, along with a growing collection of honors and powers. The old republican offices continued. There were still consuls. There was still a senate. Assemblies still met. But Augustus held the final word on matters of state. He preferred titles that sounded modest. One was princeps, meaning first citizen. Another was imperator, meaning commander. The political system he created is often called the Principate, a government that looked republican on the surface, even as it rested on one man's authority. Having secured his position, Augustus focused on governing and keeping the peace. A famous line, later repeated by Roman writers, captures the image he wanted to project: that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. His reign saw a vast building program. Temples, forums, monuments, and theaters were built or restored across the city. Two celebrated projects were the Forum of Augustus, with its temple to Mars the Avenger, and the Ara Pacis, an altar dedicated to peace. Augustus also reshaped imperial administration. He professionalized the army and fixed terms of service. He developed clearer rules for pay and retirement, and he kept most legions stationed in distant provinces rather than in Italy, reducing the risk of unrest near the capital. He also formed the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit based near Rome to protect the regime in the city. And he strengthened civil administration, drawing on equestrians and trusted freedmen to manage daily affairs, grain supply, roads, and communication. Corruption did not disappear, but Augustus kept a closer watch on provincial officials and could punish abuses more effectively than the old republic had managed. The empire continued to expand under Augustus, but he also learned when to stop. In the west, Roman power was consolidated in Spain, and the Alpine region was brought under firmer control. In the east, Augustus often relied on client kingdoms as buffers, using diplomacy and pressure rather than constant conquest. One major shock came in AD 9 in Germania. 3 legions were destroyed in the Teutoburg forest after an ambush by Germanic forces led by Arminius. After this disaster, Augustus favored caution. Roman strategy shifted. The Rhine became a stable frontier, and expansion beyond it slowed. Overall, Augustus preferred consolidation. He aimed for defensible borders and a stable center, rather than endless new wars. Augustus also shaped Roman society and culture. He passed laws meant to encourage marriage and childbearing among the elite. He supported traditional religion and public rituals, hoping to strengthen the social fabric. He was also a patron of literature. Writers like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid lived during his reign. Virgil's Aeneid, in particular, linked Rome's origins to heroic myth and helped frame Augustus as a kind of second founder. Perhaps his most lasting achievement was the peace associated with his rule. The Romans called it Pax Romana, meaning Roman peace. Beginning with Augustus and lasting in broad terms for about 2 centuries, the Mediterranean world experienced a long period of relative stability. Trade flourished, travel became safer, and Roman ways of life spread across the provinces in architecture, law, and daily custom. In a time of relative peace, the empire was not only held together by soldiers and laws, it was held together by ordinary routines, by the quiet rhythm of daily life repeated across thousands of towns and cities. To picture the Pax Romana, it helps to imagine a single day in Rome, not the day of an emperor or a senator in marble halls, but the day of an ordinary person, someone who lived in the shadow of tall buildings, who worked, who worried about prices, and who tried to find small comforts in a crowded city. Rome was loud and busy and full of motion. At dawn, carts creaked over stone streets, Vendors called out as they opened their stalls, and the smell of bread and smoke drifted through the air. In the great city, many people lived in tall apartment blocks, stacked floor by floor above narrow lanes. These rooms could be hot in summer and cold in winter. They were close to neighbors, close to noise, and close to the everyday life of the streets. Even in peaceful years, a crowded city could feel restless. Most Romans worked hard, and most lives were shaped by practical needs. Some were craftsmen, making shoes, tools, cloth, and pottery. Others carried goods through markets, served in workshops, or worked in households and small shops. In the countryside, life moved more slowly. Farmers tended vines and olives, watched over grain fields, and cared for animals. The world there felt steadier, even when the empire was changing. But peace did not mean certainty. If work disappeared, a family could struggle quickly. If prices rose or supplies failed, worry spread through neighborhoods like a rumor. This is where one famous idea enters the story: bread and circuses. Bread to keep people fed, and spectacles to keep them calm, occupied, and focused on something larger than their private troubles. For many families, grain mattered more than anything. Grain was the base of daily meals, made into bread, porridge, and simple food that could stretch across days. So the grain supply of Rome became political, watched over, and managed with care. Ships carried grain across the sea, especially from North Africa and Egypt. Officials watched the ports, warehouses stored the supply, and distributions helped keep the city stable. When food was secure, people could breathe more easily. But Roman life was not only about survival. Rome was also a city of shared spaces, where crowds moved in familiar patterns. One of the most important was the public bath, where people came not only to wash, but to rest, talk, and feel part of the city. Baths offered warm rooms, cool pools, and a gentle social rhythm. They softened the sharp edges of crowded living. For many Romans, they were a steady comfort, repeated day after day. And then there were the spectacles. Some were held in theaters with plays and performances. Others took place in the circus, where chariot races thundered around the track. Most famous of all were the games in the amphitheater. In Rome itself, the greatest amphitheater was the Colosseum, a vast ring of stone built to hold tens of thousands of people at once. From the outside, it looked like a monument, and from the inside, it felt like an entire city gathered into one place. The Colosseum was part of a larger Roman habit, turning public attention into ceremony. The empire was enormous, and most people would never see its frontiers with their own eyes. But in an afternoon at the games, they could feel the presence of Roman power. The spectacles were carefully staged and planned. They were funded by emperors and wealthy patrons, announced in advance, and remembered afterward in conversation. On the day of the games, people poured through the streets toward the arena like a steady current. For the crowd, it was a break from work and worry. It was a break from cramped rooms, heavy heat, or endless tasks. It was a shared moment, loud and communal, that drew thousands of separate lives into one single focus. At the center of that world were the gladiators. Some were enslaved men forced into training, and some were prisoners of war. Others were volunteers, drawn by pay, reputation, or a chance to escape a difficult life. They trained in special schools called ludi under strict supervision. Much of their life was repetition, footwork, balance, discipline, and endurance. To the crowd, they could look like warriors, but their world was also a profession shaped by rules and routine. The contests were not always pure chaos. There were expectations, patterns, and traditions that shaped what people saw. There were different types of fighters, each with familiar equipment, creating variety and a sense of structure. To modern eyes, it can seem strange that such displays were accepted. But for Romans, the games were tied to older ideas of courage, endurance, and public honor. They also reminded the crowd of hierarchy, power, and the order Rome claimed to bring to the world. Spectacles mattered for another reason as well. They helped bind the empire through shared experiences, repeated in cities far from Rome. Local amphitheaters echoed the capital, and local festivals echoed imperial festivals. Bread and spectacles were not the whole of Roman life. They did not erase inequality, hardship, or uncertainty. But they offered something many people wanted: a sense that the city was functioning, that food would come, and that tomorrow would look much like today. While armies guarded frontiers and emperors managed succession, most people lived in smaller moments. They worked, ate, argued, laughed, bathed, prayed, and tried to find calm in the middle of the crowd. And sometimes they gathered beneath high stone arches to watch the public games. When the day ended, the city slowly quieted. Footsteps faded, voices softened, and lights flickered behind windows. Rome settled into its nighttime stillness, while the long peace of the empire continued on. The term Pax Romana means Roman peace. It describes a long stretch of relative calm and prosperity that took hold after Augustus and the new imperial order. Historians often place this period at roughly 2 centuries, from 27 BC to AD 180. During that time, the Mediterranean world, from Britain's cold coasts to Egypt's deserts, was usually free of large, empire-wide war. The peace was not perfect. There were rebellions, tense successions, and clashes along the frontiers. But compared with the generations before and after, the Pax Romana stood out as an era of steadier government and growth. Rome's administration and infrastructure reached new heights. A traveler could move along well-built Roman roads and feel the presence of Roman law, Roman officials, and Roman soldiers. All roads lead to Rome became a popular idea in the Roman world. Highways spread outward from the capital, marked by milestones and supported by inns and way stations. Along them moved Egyptian grain, African olive oil, Spanish metals and wine, Arabian spices, silks from the East, and tin from Britain. Life varied widely across the empire. An olive farmer in Galilee, a weaver in Alexandria, a soldier on the Rhine, and a merchant in Athens lived very different days. Yet they moved within the same framework of Roman rule, shared coinage, Roman taxation, and Roman law. Over time, many people in the provinces came to value what Rome offered. Roads and aqueducts supported movement and clean water. Public baths and amphitheaters offered comfort and entertainment, and in many regions, there was greater protection from raids and local wars. Social mobility was possible, especially as the empire became more inclusive. A person born far from Italy could rise in status and sometimes reach high office. In 212, well after the classic Pax Romana, Emperor Caracalla granted citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. It was a sign of how Roman identity had expanded far beyond the city of Rome. Emperors during this era varied in temperament and ability, but Augustus's system helped maintain continuity. After Augustus died, power passed to his stepson Tiberius. The Julio-Claudian line continued through Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Not all ruled well. Caligula and Nero became infamous in later tradition for excess and cruelty. Even so, the empire's day-to-day machinery continued, supported by officials, local elites, and provincial administrators. When Nero died in 68, a brief crisis followed. In 69, 4 different generals claimed power in rapid succession. Order returned when Vespasian emerged victorious and founded the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian and his sons, Titus and Domitian, ruled for the next few decades. They also left visible symbols of Roman confidence, including the Colosseum, a massive amphitheater where thousands watched gladiatorial contests and public spectacles. After the Flavians came a line often called the 5 Good Emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, from 96 to 180. This period is often described as the high point of the Pax Romana. These rulers were frequently chosen by adoption and political judgment rather than simple inheritance. Each selected a successor who seemed capable, which tended to make transitions smoother, until Marcus Aurelius chose his biological son, Commodus. Under Trajan, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. He conquered Dacia, roughly modern Romania, and expanded Roman control deeper into the east for a short time. Hadrian took a different approach. He focused on securing borders rather than expanding them. He is remembered for Hadrian's Wall in Britain, which marked a northern limit of Roman power there. Hadrian traveled widely, inspecting provinces and commissioning building projects. One famous example is the Pantheon in Rome in its later form. Antoninus Pius presided over an unusually peaceful reign, while Marcus Aurelius, remembered as a philosopher-emperor, faced renewed pressures along the frontiers. Roman law also continued to mature. It helped anchor society in rules rather than the whims of individuals. Jurists refined ideas around property, contracts, citizenship, and justice, laying foundations that later legal systems would draw upon. Another major change began quietly during this era: the rise of Christianity. In the Roman province of Judea, Jesus of Nazareth was born during Augustus's reign and was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. His followers claimed he rose from the dead and spread his teachings across the empire. At first, Christianity was one movement among many in a diverse religious world. It also faced suspicion, especially when Christians refused to honor Roman gods or take part in rituals tied to the emperor. There were periods of persecution, though they varied by time and place. Nero, for example, blamed Christians in Rome after the Great Fire of 64, and some were punished. Even so, the faith slowly gained converts across regions and social classes. It remained a minority for a long time, but it continued to grow. For many people, this era felt unusually stable compared with the civil wars before it and the crises that would later shake the 3rd century. Some could live a full lifetime without seeing an empire-wide war or a collapse of government. That kind of steadiness was rare in the ancient world. art and culture flourished. Writers in Latin and Greek, such as Seneca, Plutarch, and Juvenal, produced works that still echo today. Engineers and builders created aqueducts, straight roads across difficult terrain, and grand public baths that became centers of daily life. Cultures also blended across the provinces. Local traditions mixed with Roman customs, creating many Roman ways of living rather than just one. In Gaul and Spain, Roman villas and Latin culture became fashionable among many elites. On the frontiers, soldiers sometimes adopted local habits in return. Life was still far from perfect. Inequality remained. Slavery was deeply woven into the economy and household life. Disasters struck too, including the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79, which buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. In such crises, the imperial government sometimes organized aid. Titus, for instance, is remembered for supporting relief after Vesuvius. Over time, the emperor was increasingly seen not only as a commander, but also as a guardian of public welfare. By the late 2nd century, subtle cracks were forming. After Marcus Aurelius died in 180, his son Commodus took the throne. His reign hinted at trouble ahead, though few could have predicted the storms of the 3rd century. For now, Rome had given the Mediterranean world generations of comparative peace. Later, people would look back on the Pax Romana with admiration and longing. It was proof that, under stable government, a vast empire could enjoy safety, trade, and cultural life beneath the shelter of Rome's eagles. One of Rome's greatest challenges was the transfer of supreme power from one ruler to the next. The empire placed real authority in a single emperor. Yet Rome never created one clear, universal rule for succession. Sometimes power passed to a son, sometimes to an adopted heir, and sometimes to a commander backed by troops. For long stretches, this uncertainty stayed quiet. The empire could still feel steady, but the danger never fully disappeared. Even during the Pax Romana, an emperor's position depended on loyalty, especially the loyalty of the army. Over time, the Praetorian Guard and the legions on distant frontiers became more than protectors. In moments of weakness, they could influence who ruled next. And once that became possible, the old sense of predictability began to fade. The empire still functioned, but the ground felt less firm beneath it. In the 2nd century, Rome found a calmer pattern for a while. Emperors often chose successors by adoption, selecting someone capable and preparing him in advance. Power could pass more smoothly, almost like the empire had learned to breathe again. But adoption was never written into law. It was a habit, not a rule, and habits can break. When the balance weakened, succession became sharper and more dangerous. Power could be seized, fought over, and defended by force. This changing mood is often linked to Septimius Severus. His reign signaled an era when emperors relied more openly on military strength. The army's approval began to matter more than tradition. A famous line later attributed to him captures the spirit of the time. "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men." Whether he spoke those exact words or not, the message fits the age. Keep the army satisfied, because the army held the empire together. And as military importance grew, the style of rule changed as well. It became more openly autocratic. Titles and ceremonies began to feel more regal and more distant. further from Rome's older republican language. In time, emperors could be addressed as dominus, meaning master or lord, instead of the earlier, softer title princeps. Rome was still Rome, but the tone of authority was shifting. By the early 3rd century, pressure was rising along the frontiers. Wars and raids demanded constant attention, and soldiers grew tense and watchful. They judged their leaders harshly, and an emperor who seemed cautious could be seen as weak. That is why 235 is often treated as a turning point. In that year, Emperor Alexander Severus was killed by his own troops during a campaign. The soldiers raised another commander in his place, Maximinus Thrax. Many historians treat that moment as the practical end of the Pax Romana. After 235, the rhythm of power changed. Over the next few decades, emperors rose and fell at a dangerous pace, often through violence, sometimes after only a short time in power. In some stretches, a new ruler appeared every few years, and the feeling of instability spread far beyond politics. Augustus had once balanced imperial power with the outward forms of the Republic. But by the middle of the 3rd century, being emperor had become one of the most perilous roles in the world. It was desired, and it was often deadly. Rome's stability depended on a ruler's character and on the loyalty of the legions. When those forces aligned, the empire held together. When they did not, turmoil followed. And so, as the 3rd century opens, Rome begins to move toward a deeper crisis. Civil wars, invasions, economic strain, and disease began to weigh on the empire all at once. Even so, the Roman world would find ways to endure. It would adapt, reorganize, and recover. In time, it would reshape itself yet again, and the empire's story would continue in a new form. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire entered one of its most difficult eras. Historians often date this long crisis from 235 to 284. The empire was tested by internal conflict, pressure at the borders, financial strain, and recurring disease. Rome was still vast and powerful, but it no longer felt secure in the same way. At moments, it seemed possible that the system might not hold, and yet it did. By the end of the century, Rome was changed, but still standing. After 235, emperors were often made and unmade by armies. This period is sometimes called the Age of Barracks Emperors because military camps became the place where power was decided. Rulers rose and fell quickly, sometimes after only a short time in office. In some stretches, several claimants appeared at once, each backed by different legions. As loyalty shifted toward commanders, the center struggled to hold everything together. That weakness made Rome slower to respond to danger, and beyond the frontiers, danger was growing. Along the Rhine and Danube, Germanic groups, including Goths, Franks, and Alemanni, raided deeper into Roman territory. Some Gothic forces even attacked by sea, striking coastal cities in Greece and Asia Minor. Frontiers that had once been tightly managed now felt thinner. The empire still had armies, but it had less certainty. In the east, Rome faced a different kind of threat. A new Persian dynasty, the Sasanians, had replaced the older Parthian rulers. Their kings were more centralized and more openly determined to challenge Rome. One of the most formidable Sasanian rulers was Shapur I, the king of Persia during Rome's time of weakness. He led repeated campaigns against Roman territory and won major victories. And then, in 260, something nearly unthinkable happened. Emperor Valerian was defeated and captured alive by Shapur. Roman sources later described the event in dramatic terms. Accounts differ on the details, but Valerian died in captivity. It was the only time a Roman emperor is known to have been taken prisoner of war. The shock spread widely. If an emperor could be captured, what was truly secure? As central authority weakened, some regions began to pull away. In the west, parts of Gaul and Britain, and for a time, regions of Hispania, formed a semi-independent Gallic Empire from 260 to 274. These provinces still considered themselves Roman, but they no longer followed orders from Italy. In the east, a powerful center emerged at Palmyra. Queen Zenobia took advantage of the chaos and built a rival dominion, expanding into Roman Arabia and Egypt. She also promoted her young son as an imperial figure. For a time, Roman power fractured into separate blocks. The unity Augustus had built looked as though it might finally unravel. Inside the empire, daily life grew harder. Constant war drained resources, and trade could be disrupted. Rulers debased the currency to keep paying soldiers, reducing the precious metal content of coins. Confidence weakened and prices rose. Some cities shrank or surrounded themselves with stronger defenses, and disease returned as well. One major wave is often called the Plague of Cyprian, commonly dated from 249 to 262. We cannot measure its full scale with certainty, but the impact was serious. With fewer people to work, pay taxes, and serve in the legions, pressure increased across the empire. For ordinary people, this era could feel unsettled. One year brought one emperor, the next year brought another. Taxes might go to Rome one season, and to a local strongman the next. In border regions, raids could burn crops and break supply lines without warning. Even the city of Rome felt less secure than it once had. In the later 3rd century, new walls were built around the capital, the Aurelian walls. They were a practical admission that Rome could no longer rely on distance and reputation alone. Even in chaos, capable leaders emerged. One of the most important was Emperor Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275. In only a few years, he earned the title Restitutor Orbis, meaning restorer of the world. He defeated invaders closer to Italy. He turned east and brought down Zenobia's Palmyrene state. Then he forced the Gallic Empire to return to Roman control. By 274, the empire was politically united again. Aurelian strengthened defenses, but like many emperors of the era, he was killed by his own officers. Even so, his victories bought Rome something priceless: time. The deeper challenge was making stability last. Stability returned more firmly under Emperor Diocletian in 284. After decades of rapid turnover, simply holding power was an achievement. Diocletian understood that the empire was too large and too threatened for one man to manage alone. So he introduced the tetrarchy, meaning rule of 4. In 293, authority was divided among 4 co-emperors, 2 senior rulers titled Augustus and 2 junior rulers titled Caesar. Each ruler could stay closer to danger zones, defend frontiers, and keep order locally. The Caesars were also meant to be designated successors, reducing succession wars. It was a practical attempt to keep the empire from tearing itself apart again. In the midst of reform, Diocletian also launched a major campaign against Christians. In 303, he began what is often called the Great Persecution. Churches were targeted, scriptures seized, and Christians pressured to sacrifice to Roman gods. The intensity varied across regions, and it did not last long everywhere. The campaign did not succeed in ending Christianity, and it came shortly before the empire would move in a very different religious direction under later rulers. In 305, Diocletian did something almost unheard of. He abdicated voluntarily and compelled Maximian to do the same. The junior Caesars were meant to become the new Augusti, continuing the system smoothly. Diocletian retired to a palace at Spalatum, near modern Split. Later tradition says he spent his retirement tending a garden. The plan looked orderly on paper, but it did not hold. Disputes among the next generation soon triggered new conflicts. Even so, the empire Diocletian rebuilt was far stronger than the one he inherited. Out of those struggles, one ruler would rise and reshape Rome again. That ruler was Constantine. At the dawn of the 4th century, the Roman Empire was remade once again, this time under one dominant figure, Constantine, later called Constantine the Great. His rise ended the Tetrarchy's experiment in shared rule and set the empire on new paths. Christianity gained official protection, and a new imperial capital took shape in the east. These changes ran so deep that it makes sense to speak of a new Rome emerging. The empire was still Roman, but its center of gravity was beginning to shift, and Rome's story was about to take on a different tone. Constantine was the son of Constantius, one of Diocletian's junior emperors, the Caesars. When Constantius died in 306, troops with him in Britain proclaimed Constantine emperor. That single moment pulled him into the struggle that followed the Tetrarchy's collapse. What came next was a long sequence of wars, bargains, and rival claims. Constantine advanced steadily through the turmoil, removing opponents one by one. Over time, it became clear he was not simply surviving the system, he was replacing it. A pivotal moment came in 312 at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome. Constantine faced the rival emperor Maxentius. The battle would decide who controlled the Western Empire. On the eve of the fight, Constantine is said to have experienced a striking vision. Christian writers later claimed he saw a sign connected with Christ and received a promise of victory, often summarized as, "In this sign you will conquer." He then ordered a Christian symbol, commonly described as the Chi Rho, to be used by his troops. Constantine won a decisive victory. The exact details of the vision are debated and accounts vary, but the effect was real. Constantine's triumph became linked to Christianity in the public imagination. That connection would reshape the empire's future. In 313, Constantine and the Eastern Emperor Licinius issued what is commonly called the Edict of Milan. It granted freedom of worship across the empire and gave Christians legal protection from persecution. Christianity could now operate openly. Constantine supported the church with donations and privileges, but he did not outlaw older cults all at once. Instead, he treated Christianity as a stabilizing force, something that could help unify a wounded empire. Over time, his support became more visible and more decisive. The alliance between Constantine and Licinius did not last. Tensions grew, and eventually they fought for control. In 324, Constantine defeated Licinius and became sole ruler of a reunited empire. His religious role expanded as well. In 325, he convened the Council of Nicaea, gathering bishops from across the empire to address disputes and define doctrine. An emperor was now shaping religious unity in a public, official way. Empire and church were becoming intertwined. One of Constantine's most lasting choices was to build a new imperial capital. He selected Byzantium on the Bosporus, a strategic location linking Europe and Asia. On that site, he created a grand new city and named it Constantinople, meaning the city of Constantine. In 330, Constantinople was formally dedicated. It was often called New Rome or Nova Roma because Constantine gave it institutions that echoed the old capital, including a senate. He also encouraged elite families to relocate there. The site offered major advantages. Water protected it on several sides. It stood on vital trade routes, and it allowed faster response to threats in the Balkans and the East. Rome in Italy remained symbolically important, but Constantinople increasingly became the administrative heart of the empire. Under Constantine and his successors, Christianity moved from the margins toward the center of public life. Churches rose in major cities. Bishops gained influence. Constantine himself was baptized shortly before his death in 337, following a pattern that was fairly common among high-status converts of the era. Traditional worship did not vanish overnight. Pagan temples remained. Older rituals continued in many places for a time. But the direction was clear. Within a few generations, Christianity became the official state religion. Emperor Theodosius I declared it so in 380, while also moving to restrict older public rites. This transformed the empire's identity. Emperors were now increasingly presented as chosen by God and as guardians of the Christian faith. It added a new layer to imperial authority. The Constantinian dynasty continued through much of the 4th century, though not without conflict. After Constantine's death, his sons divided the empire and fought each other. Later, rulers restored stability for a time, including Theodosius I. In 395, when Theodosius died, the empire was divided between his two sons. One ruled in the east from Constantinople, the other ruled in the west from Italy. From that point onward, East and West followed increasingly separate paths. The Eastern Empire would endure for many centuries. The Western Empire, however, would struggle under growing pressures. Before the Western decline comes fully into view, it helps to see what Constantine set in motion. By founding Constantinople, he strengthened an Eastern center that would resist many threats for centuries. By supporting Christianity, he began a transformation that would shape Europe and beyond. He also continued Diocletian's shift toward stronger central control. Administration remained heavily bureaucratic and tightly managed, especially in the East, where imperial systems stayed more resilient. A new Rome had formed, more Greek-speaking over time, spiritually transformed, and oriented toward the Eastern Mediterranean. As the 4th century progressed, people could still recognize Rome. Legions guarded frontiers. Governors issued edicts. Latin remained the language of law in the West. But the old religious world was fading. A new capital had risen, and the meaning of Roman was changing. Constantine's reign was a watershed. It helped the empire survive in a different shape, even as the western half moved toward collapse. And while the West would fall in the 5th century, the East would preserve Roman institutions long after, carrying Rome's legacy into a new age. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. The strong central authority built under Augustus had been worn down by crises, invasions, and political weakness. While the Eastern Empire remained relatively robust, the West struggled with constant pressure from outside and instability within. This decline was not one sudden collapse. It was a long, uneven retreat as Roman control faded from province to province. The world still looked Roman in many ways, but the foundations were beginning to crack. One of the most symbolic shocks came in 410. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, entered Italy and marched on Rome. In late summer, they sacked the city. For the first time in centuries, Rome lay at the mercy of a foreign army. The Visigoths did not erase the city from the map, and many churches were spared, but the psychological impact was immense. A later Christian writer, Jerome, captured the mood in a line often repeated: "The city that had once taken the world had itself been taken." Rome endured, but the old sense of invincibility was gone. From that moment on, it was easier to imagine a future in which Rome was no longer the unquestioned center of the world. The Western Empire's borders had been under strain for generations. Now, whole peoples were on the move, pushed in part by the rising power of the Huns. In the early 5th century, groups such as the Vandals, Suebi, and Burgundians crossed the Rhine and poured into Roman Gaul and Spain. Rome's armies were stretched thin, and leadership in the West was often divided or ineffective. The Vandals moved through Gaul into Spain. Then, under their king Genseric, they crossed into North Africa and seized provinces that had long been vital to Rome's strength and finances. In 455, the Vandals even sailed to Italy and plundered Rome. The city was not destroyed, but its wealth was stripped and many captives were taken. Each blow left the Western Empire poorer, weaker, and harder to defend. Meanwhile, Roman rule in Britain effectively ended in the early 5th century. Troops withdrew, and the island was left to defend itself against new waves of raids and settlement. In Gaul and Spain, authority splintered as local commanders and foreign kings carved out their own realms. There were still moments of resistance. The Roman general Aetius, working with Visigothic allies, helped stop Attila the Hun at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451. Because of victories like this, Aetius is sometimes called the last of the Romans. But even a success like 451 could not reverse the larger trend. The West was losing land, money, and manpower faster than it could recover. In the final years, real power in the West often belonged to military strongmen rather than emperors. The imperial court at Ravenna was well defended, but it was also isolated. Its rulers were frequently figureheads. In 475, a general named Orestes placed his teenage son on the throne. The boy's name was Romulus Augustulus, often translated as Little Augustus. It was a strangely fitting name for the last figure in the Western line. He ruled in name only, and for less than a year. In 476, a Germanic commander named Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus. According to later tradition, Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, suggesting that one emperor was enough. He did not claim the imperial title. Instead, he ruled Italy as king, acknowledging the Eastern emperor in theory while acting independently. This quiet coup is conventionally marked as the end of the Western Roman Empire. There was no single final battle in the streets of Rome. The Western imperial office simply vanished, and it never returned. Even after the Western Empire ended as a political entity, Roman civilization did not disappear. The Eastern Empire continued for centuries, preserving Roman law, administration, and identity. Its people still called themselves Romans, even as later historians labeled them Byzantines. In the West, Germanic kings often tried to preserve Roman structures. They minted coins, issued laws in Latin, and relied on Roman officials to govern Roman populations. Theodoric the Great, who ruled Italy after Odoacer, maintained Roman traditions and infrastructure to a remarkable degree. So the empire ended in the West, but the Roman world did not simply switch off like a lamp. It changed shape. One of the strongest carriers of Roman legacy in the West was the Christian Church. By the 5th century, Christianity was firmly established, and the Church in Rome increasingly filled gaps left by weakening imperial authority. Latin remained the language of the Church and of learning. Monasteries and clerics preserved Christian writings and also copied many works of classical literature, helping ancient knowledge survive into the medieval centuries. Where emperors could no longer hold the West together, the Church provided continuity, religious, cultural, and linguistic. Roman law endured powerfully too. In the East, Emperor Justinian compiled the Corpus Juris Civilis, preserving and organizing Roman legal thought. Centuries later, this inheritance shaped many European legal systems, especially ideas about property, contracts, and civil rights. Language carried Rome forward as well. Latin gradually evolved into the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, while Latin itself remained central to scholarship and religion. Even English absorbed a vast stock of Latin-derived words, often through French and formal education. Rome's empire ended, but Rome's vocabulary never stopped traveling. Even the prestige of Rome lived on. In 800, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans, an attempt to revive imperial legitimacy in the West. Later rulers claimed the Roman mantle in their own languages. Tsar and Kaiser both echo Caesar. In a sense, Rome became more than a state. It became a symbol of power, law, civilization, and continuity, an idea later ages kept trying to inherit. The Eastern Empire carried the direct imperial line until 1453, when Constantinople fell. By then, Eastern Romans had preserved much ancient knowledge and helped transmit it back to Western Europe, feeding the Renaissance and the revival of classical learning. Even today, we still feel Rome everywhere. We see it in laws, languages, architecture, and civic institutions. We see it in roads and city plans, in arches and calendars, in titles and traditions. Empires come and go, but the strongest parts of what they create can outlast them. The Western Empire ended in the 5th century, but Roman civilization continued in the East, in the Church, in law, and in the long memory of Europe. And in the quiet of a modern night, when someone thinks about ancient times, the fact that we still tell Rome's story is itself a kind of tribute. Rome passed, but its light did not go out. And that brings our story to a close for tonight. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed it, a like is always appreciated. And if you'd like to hear more, you're welcome to subscribe. Until then, rest easy. Good night.